All right, I see the message that we're now streaming live on YouTube. I call the meeting of the Subcommittee on Minnesota Water Policy to order. Today is September 16th, 2020. The time is approximately 3:02, and we do have quorum at this point in time. First item we have is approval of our minutes from the August 17th, 2020 meeting. And have people had a chance to review that? And if so, is there a motion to approve?
I would make a motion to approve, Chair Fisher.
Okay, it's been moved by Representative Poston to approve the minutes. Is there any discussion or corrections at this point? Hearing none, all in favor of approving the minutes as sent out, signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, motion carries. Next item on the agenda, and I'll turn it over to Executive Director Jim Stark, is the Upper Mississippi Land Preservation Pilot. If you'd like to take over at this point, Jim.
And Mr. Chair and members, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I want to spend a bit of time talking again about the Upper Mississippi River Basin. We had a discussion about that at our last meeting, and I want to follow up on that and discuss some things with you. We have a really good opportunity in the Upper Mississippi River Basin to demonstrate the value of the various environmental programs that, when taken in total, are approaching the 75% goal that's estimated to be needed to protect our lakes and our rivers in that area, as well as protecting the source water for much of the metropolitan area. This is a priority issue for the Clean Water Council. We've talked about this before. In the Upper Mississippi River Basin, that includes things like working forests, working agricultural lands, lands with environmental easements, parks and wildlife management areas, and national forests as some examples. By assessing the amounts of land that we have in these categories, we could provide a check on land protection, and it would provide, I think, a really great example for the combined value of those programs, of the many state, federal, and local programs in that area. However, we need to make sure that we're counting all those lands. It's a bit unclear, this is very complicated. There are many of the state agencies, federal agencies, some nonprofits that all have a hand in protecting and preserving these lands. And it's not crystal clear to me that anyone has an absolute handle on that. So we need to make sure we're counting all those lands and that they and have them accounted for in this 75% goal. So what I'm suggesting is a small pilot done by this committee to make sure that we're accounting for all those lands. First, in two small sub-watersheds within that Upper Mississippi River Basin. Those would be Portage Lake, the Portage Lake watershed, which is in the Pine River watershed, and Woman Lake, which is in the Leech Lake watershed. If we could be successful at that, we could then carry that process forward as a demonstration of the value of the constitutional amendments for the environment. This small pilot effort would do several things. It would provide a compilation of protected lands and would assess progress toward those clean water goals set by the clean water programs. It would evaluate the settings of preserved lands with respect to those outlined by the Nature Conservancy that are most important. And it would address the following question: is our commitment as strong in these areas as they are in areas where we're trying to improve and enhance water in the rest of the state? It would, I think, provide a really great example of the value of the constitutional amendments as well as other programs. So what I'm asking you to consider would be for your approval to take the next step. That would be just a small pilot to make sure we're accounting for all these lands that are being protected. And if you're okay with that process, I would come back to you at our next meeting and give you more details on how this committee could work with the agencies to do that kind of an evaluation. So this would be a pilot. If it was successful and could be done efficiently and quickly, we'd move on to the rest of the larger upper Mississippi watershed. And the product, I think, would be a small document, a pamphlet that would describe the importance of the amendments and other environmental programs. So with that, if there's any discussion, what I'm asking for is just the opportunity to give me a month to work with the agencies to see if this information could be checked for completeness and put forward to you as a pilot.
Okay, thank you. I see that we have a question. Senator Weber, if you'd like to go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know that you'd be working on getting some information for us for the next meeting, but do you have a concept right at this point, Mr. Stark, as to how this project might be funded? Whether it, depending upon its timing, et cetera?
Sure, Mr. Chair and Senator. I think it wouldn't require any additional funding. I think this could be done just in communication with the agencies, some of the nonprofits and federal agencies, just checking to make sure. So the Board of Water and Soil Resources has a pretty good idea of these lands. You actually have a map in your packets from the Board of Water and Soil Resources, which kind of outlines their take on our progress toward those goals. I think we just need to do some checking and communication with the other agencies to make sure we've included everything that we can. So you'll see a map of the upper Mississippi River watershed. It's a little detailed, a little difficult to read on your screen, but it kind of outlines where the Board of Water and Soil Resources thinks we are. And I just want to make sure that we're accounting for everything within the federal government and for some of the nonprofit organizations that hold easements, for example. So I don't think it wouldn't take any money at this point. It would just take some coordination and accumulation of information that already exists.
All
And
right.
the same, I think, would be true for the upper Mississippi if we would carry this forward.
Senator Weber, any other questions?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. Representative Torkelson, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Representative Fisher. Mr. Stark, is there an outline of how you're going to evaluate the success? I mean, is this just an acreage only kind of approach, or are we looking at actual water quality data from the PCA's testing program? What's going to be involved?
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Representative, that goal of 60 to 70% is something that's pretty well documented by work done by the Department of Natural Resources. So based on research that has already been done, that's an estimate of that goal. And in addition to that, the Nature Conservancy has done some additional work to try to target specific lands, for example, those closest to the lakes and rivers we're talking about as priorities. So most of that work exists in peer-reviewed research and is there for us to use.
Representative Torkelson, do you have further questions?
Well, I think I heard an answer in there. It sounds like it's going to be an acreage-based approach. Is that kind of the bottom line?
Mr. Chair and Representative, for the most part, it's an area-based approach. However, there's some targeting that goes on with respect to waters.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Representative Torkelson. Are there any other questions that people may have? Mr. Stark, will we need to take a vote to have you continue on with this process then?
Mr. Chair, I don't know that we need a vote unless there's discussion and opposition to this. I'll just move forward and get back to you at our next meeting.
Unless I hear any other feedback or see any hands go up, which I'm not yet, I would say that sounds appropriate as to continue moving forward with this project then.
Okay, Mr. Chair, thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Next item on the agenda, private well testing at point of sale. And that will be Mr. Stark and Mr. Gardner. If you'd like to start us off, Mr. Stark, and we can then move on from there.
Yeah, Paul, are you on? I don't see you, but
I'm on.
okay, good, thanks. So this is a discussion about the importance of private well testing at the point of sale. This is a topic that's been discussed positively by the Clean Water Council, by the policy subcommittee of the Clean Water Council. In addition to that, last session, a bill was introduced by this subcommittee, both in the House and the Senate, which would have required water testing of domestic and private wells within 6 months of a property sale. It also included some work that would, some educational work on drinking water safety and safety education for well owners. So this is a follow-up discussion of that. With that, I think I'll let Mr. Gardner talk a bit about the discussion that's gone on in the Clean Water Council. And then what we're really looking for here from you is some discussion about next steps and moving this forward.
Okay, Mr. Gardner, if you'd like to go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Jim had asked me to speak on this issue. It should take about 60 seconds. Our policy committee on the Clean Water Council forwarded a recommendation that the full council approved and will be included in our biennial recommendations report to the legislature on December 1. But what it does is essentially recommend or support the idea of just what's in those bills that Representative Lippert and Senator Uyghur introduced, that when a house or when a property is sold, there should be a well test that is given to the buyer that includes testing for bacteria, nitrate, arsenic, and lead. The House bill was amended to include lead, and then the health department suggested that manganese also be a part of that because of its potential neurological impacts, especially to infants. So, but we're in alignment, I think, is all I'm saying, and I think that took about 60 seconds.
Okay, very good. Any questions that anybody has for either Mr. Stark or Mr. Gardner? Okay, hearing none, I would say that from what I want to say, thank you for the review and presentation on it. Of course, I'm a little biased being a co-author of the original bill, that this is something that we want to continue to push going forward. I know it's very important. I know that in the East Metro area, there's been a lot of private wells, and with some of the legacy contamination out there, that'd be something we want to hit. I do see Senator Weber has raised his hand. Senator Weber, if you'd like to go ahead, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I do want to comment about the letter that we've received from the Realtors Association. You know, as a real estate broker, I do tend to agree with the points that they've made. You know, out here, being in the country, anytime that number one, there's obviously has to be a disclosure to a potential property owner, whether or not they are on a community system or whether it's a private system, as far as their drinking water is concerned. You know, I have seen many situations whereby the lender is out there actually saying, yeah, let's get a water test so we know what we're doing. I think what we do is every time we mandate something, we increase its cost. And that's what's going to happen in this scenario as well. You know, locally here, most of the time, people can take it to our county health department and get a water test for probably 10, 15 bucks. But we start, you know, putting more onto that, more responsibility onto that system. I think that's probably going to change. And so I guess right now I tend to agree with the realtors at this point.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Stark.
Mr. Chair and members, if I could, I meant to bring that letter up, and if I can summarize it for you very briefly. They're not opposed to the concept and need for water testing. They are concerned about that being done at the point of sale, and would suggest, I think, discussions with the agencies about a program, a repetitive program to sample wells that would not be mandated at point of sale. So if that's a summary, I believe, of the letter from the Minnesota Realtors Association.
Yeah. Very good. Other comments or questions out there? I saw a hand pop up, then it went down, that people have at this point. Question that
Mr. Chair,
I'm
Mr.
sorry,
Chair,
go
I
ahead.
jump in. It's Representative Lippert. I'm on the phone.
Go ahead, Representative
so-
Lippert.
So I would just say, I think, I do think this is a basic consumer protection. I had some conversation with the realtors about this. I think the point of sale is an appropriate time for us to have this testing, and there are major costs to being unaware that your water is contaminated. So clean water in rural places is a significant concern, and I think this is a good step forward. So I just want to voice my support for moving forward.
All right, thank you, Representative Lippert. I see next up we have Representative Brand has his hand up. Go ahead, Representative Brand. Jeff Brand, can you hear us? Not able to hear Representative Brand at this point. We'll go on to Senator Draheim then. Senator Draheim.
Thank you. I guess my 2 cents on that is, as someone that practices real estate and that has a dozen or so agents under him, and we do a lot of rural properties with wells. And if it is financed, I would say 90% of the time, they require a water test. What is in that water test varies depending on the lender institution. And it's already required that we fill out a disclosure. So if they're using a licensed real estate agent or a realtor, they should have a well disclosure at, hopefully before they put an offer in on a property. So I think there is some protection out there already for consumers. I think we need to work with the Realtor Association on this and find a happy medium. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Draheim. I see Representative Heinzman has his hand up. Go ahead, Representative Heinzman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I joined a little bit late, but I've heard some of the discussion here, and it's interesting to get the perspective of those that are familiar with real estate, the realtors specifically. Thank you, Senator, for that. And then, in my own experience and conversations with realtors here in the Lakes area, I'm hearing similar comments being made. So I think there does need to be a broader discussion with those folks, and it just makes sense to have more information before adding more regulatory requirements to a process that's already very complex. And so I guess I'm to some extent echoing those concerns, trying to push forward with this before getting more affected parties involved in the discussion.
Okay. Thank you, Representative Heinzman. Try again, Representative Brand, you've got your hand up there and you're unmuted if you'd like to try going ahead this time. Not able to hear you yet, Representative Brand. I don't know if the problem's on our end or if it's on your end. Not able to see or hear you. Representative Brand, are you trying to talk there, sir? Do you have a comment or question? Yeah, I don't know what it is, or,
Mr. Chair,
yes, go ahead, sir.
Casey may have some suggestions. I think he could chat something in if he has a question too, so.
Okay, why don't we try the chat function there to see if that might help out. And did we just lose Representative Brand? I think we've kind of lost Representative Brand at this point. Does anyone else have any other questions or things that they'd like to mention at this point in time on the requiring the water testing at time of sale? I know we've had a few comments already. All right, not seeing any other hands going up. Is there any additional action that we need to take on this issue at this point in time, Mr. Stark?
Mr. Chair, members, hearing what I've heard from you, I think it might be appropriate for me to contact the realtors and have a discussion with them about their ideas that they brought forward some ideas in their letter, and to get back to you next month with some of those thoughts.
Okay. No, that sounds like a good idea. And what would be nice to know too is, I know that they have concerns out there, is what is the average cost of the testing that we're looking at too?
Mr. Chair, I can find that out for you. That's pretty simple.
All right. All right. Thank you very much. We will then move on to the next item on the agenda here as I grab my agenda out in front of me. And that would be going on to SWCD financial support. And this is a combination of Mr. Gardner and Mr. Stark. Mr. Stark, if you'd like to go ahead and start off on this issue that I know that as a group we have wrestled with over the last few years. As we know, this is very important, finding these ongoing financial support they need to be successful in the future. And it's been one that's also been very difficult trying to find that answer. So looking forward to hear what the thoughts are and what we're going to hear at this point in time. Go ahead, Mr. Stark.
Mr. Chair and members, thank you. This is a continuing discussion. I'll just preface this by saying that during this session, we had a bill supported by the subcommittee and introduced, which would have ramped down the contribution from the clean water funds in support of SWCDs, and would have supplemented that over a period of time with general funds. So that was introduced. Of course, the landscape with respect to the general fund has changed significantly since that time. So we need to revisit this. The budget and outcome committee of the Clean Water Council has also discussed this. And I think with this, I'll turn the next part of this discussion over to Mr. Gardner to talk about their decision and where the Budget and Outcomes Committee stands on this issue of support for SWCDs. And then finally, we do have Ann Buckley from the Association of SWCDs is here and would like to testify.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mr. Stark. Mr. Gardner, if you'd like to go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I'm Paul Gardner, the administrator for the Clean Water Council. One of our duties in statute is the council recommends how to spend the Clean Water Fund every 2 years, and we will also have those recommendations by December 1. But the council also makes recommendations during the last biennium, had identical recommendations as the governor's office. So the council has inserted its recommendations into the governor's budget process and timeline. So that's why in September, we're looking at making recommendations now so that we can get those numbers in time. The council just wanted to reaffirm the value that soil and water conservation districts bring to improving water quality in Minnesota. I don't think anybody doubts that. The main issue at hand is how we can address the opportunity cost for water quality when we have to take out $20-some million out of the Clean Water Fund for soil and water conservation districts for capacity funding. So over the last 6-8 months, a lot of us, including the SWCDs themselves and the Clean Water Council and the governor's office agencies, have been deliberating various ideas for how we can avoid using the Clean Water Fund for the soil and water conservation districts. That's $24 million in the current biennium. There isn't a magic bullet there yet. People are starting to get a little stressed out as we get closer to the new legislature in January. But I wanted to bring you up to speed on what the council is in the process of doing right now. So we have a budget committee of the Clean Water Council, the Budget and Outcomes Committee, or BOC, and they met roughly 10 days ago, and they decided, for a couple of reasons, which I'll mention in a minute, not to recommend funding for SWCDs in our current recommendations for the Clean Water Fund. That was for a couple of reasons. The council hasn't recommended that funding in the past, although the legislature has used clean water funds eventually. And so the council didn't really want to set a precedent for recommending that funding in its own recommendations. There's also a lot of uncertainty about where we're going to go with the revenue forecast in November and March. But there's a big however here. While they didn't recommend funding, the council is really committed to finding an arrangement where we can at least defray some of the costs for SWCDs without using the Clean Water Fund. There is an acknowledgement in our budget committee that that some clean water funds may be used by the legislature, hopefully in agreement with the executive branch in some fashion between now and May, that might use some clean water funds and other sources coming from a couple of other places. However, it's premature because some of those other options are have too many moving parts to insert in our process right now, that we just chose to keep the recommendations clean. Some of these other options, well, I'll offer a hypothetical that we have talked about, but it is so hypothetical that it is not in our recommendations. But if it would help, I think it's certainly possible that we could find a way to fund half of the requirement that SWCDs need, and then find several other sources that could chip in $1 million here and $1 million there to get us to the number we need to hit. The problem is that some of those other hypothetical options don't travel within the environmental finance or legacy finance bills. So there are some revenue sources in the tax bill that look at their fee scenarios. While controversial, there are things that are covered by the Clean Water Fund in other areas that could be covered by some fees that haven't been touched for many years. Again, a hypothetical. The levying authority issue has always come up. There has been, I had some legislators, not on this subcommittee, suggest the idea of using the Clean Water Fund reserve, which is in the vicinity of $10 to $12 million, and using part of that, perhaps at the end of the fiscal 23, to help make it work. But we do know that general funds are off the table. We're not having any fantasies that anybody could be persuaded to use general funds, because you will have $5 billion in a general fund deficit. The issue is now being elevated a lot here in the executive branch, so higher up the food chain than the Clean Water Council itself. So I understand that the commissioners are going to be talking about some of those alternatives to see if any of them would fly and could be incorporated as part of the governor's budget in addition to the Clean Water Fund. But we're just not there yet. So I just wanted to say that for now, we're not including any money for SWCDs in the Clean Water Fund recommendations. But the council's budget committee would like to leave the door open to some sort of global agreement, you might say. And that requires a lot more stakeholders, and people are starting to get more laser focused on what to do. And Leanne and I have been trying to think this through for months and haven't gotten as much attention as we are now getting. So it's a good sign that people are much more interested in finding a solution. So we still have time. I'm told that we don't have to get our numbers into the to Minnesota Management and Budget until November even. So we have some options to float some ideas around. And I'll be frank, the who's in charge in May of the houses and committees can have an impact on what some of those alternative solutions might be acceptable, and ideas that might be not workable now might be at the 11th hour. So we're not really sure, but it's just we need to have more buy-in from more people, including the legislature, before we could come up with a global agreement. Mr. Chair, maybe I'll leave it there and see if anybody has any questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Gardner. I do see one question right offhand. I see Representative Heinzman has his hand up. Representative Heinzman, if you'd like to go ahead, please.
I would. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start with a question. Mr. Gardner, could you remind me again, did you say that the Clean Water Fund provided, what was it, 23 or $26 million for SWCDs in the previous biennium?
In the current biennium in 2021, it's 24 million, and I don't think any of that was unallotted. Ms. Buck may be able to correct me. And then I think it was 22 in the biennium or two before that.
Okay, Mr. Chair, follow up.
Right, go ahead, Representative Heinzman.
Do we have that information? I was waiting briefly, but I didn't hear anybody chiming in, so I can follow that question up if there isn't any information.
Why don't you go ahead? I'm not seeing or hearing right offhand.
Okay, I'll go ahead, Mr. Chair. Thank you. So I guess what my next question would be is I heard Mr. Gardner say that there was pots of money, millions specifically, that was potentially a funding source. What would Mr. Gardner, maybe Mr. Gardner, I should just ask specifically, what are you referring to when you mention those sources, and what are they currently being spent on?
Sure, Mr. Chair, Representative Heinzman, and I want to keep attaching the word hypothetical. These are actually suggestions that have been suggested to the council, and the council has no position on these ideas at present. But one has been spending part of the reserve, which is $10 to $12 million or so, although we have been cautioned by fiscal staff that you never want to spend your reserve. But one senator in particular said that it's a rainy day fund, and it's raining. One source of funding that was also suggested to us, which I understand now is opposed by many local government entities, is the use of riparian protection aid that travels through the tax bill. And the deal was, when the buffer law went into place, that there would be money available for counties to do enforcement. And as we understand it, the compliance rate for buffers now is quite high. And then counties are opposed to repurposing any of that money for reasons that are reasonable. But that's $16 million per biennium being spent right now. In terms of fees, there are some fees that haven't been raised for things like fertilizer, some of them since 1989. Obviously, that opens up another can of worms in a bad farm economy, but that might bring in $1 million or $2 million to cover some nitrate-related programs. Again, hypothetical. And then, you've heard the idea of granting levying authority to soil and water districts. I don't know if that's something that the SWCDs are still interested in. That wouldn't bring any money, I don't think, until fiscal 23. And then I've heard members on both parties in the House talk about the idea of some efficiencies with either the combination of soil and water districts and creation of watershed districts, or some combination thereof. I don't know that would save money immediately in 22-23, but I know that Representative Torkelson had a bill to at least study it to see if there's any savings or efficiency. I don't know what the subcommittee's thinking is on that. So these are all hypothetical examples that could get you a couple of million here and there, and you could have the Clean Water Fund cover half and come up with something. But again, hypothetical ideas. And in the meantime, rather than trying to get cute and come up with some Rube Goldberg device here in the recommendations, the council just wants to keep it clean for now until we can think of something. I hope that was probably a longer answer than you were looking for, Representative.
Sure.
Representative Heinzman, other questions that you might have or comments?
Thank you for the opportunity to follow up, Mr. Chair. Just a comment. I would like to follow up after having heard some of those suggestions that I'm going to have to take issue with with 2 points specifically. Number one, the idea that the Clean Water Fund needs a clean bill because they don't specifically think of Soil and Water Conservation District funding as a good use of the resource there, the dollars there. That I think is a really short-sighted perspective when considering what the clean water dollars have traditionally been used for and the good work that is being done with that money at the Soil and Water Conservation District level. I'm glad that the council is considering what other monies might be available besides. My audio probably cut out for a second. I apologize, Mr. Chair.
All right.
I'm glad the council is considering other potential sources for revenues besides a general fund, because that would be a huge mistake right now, and I think we all understand why. I'm hoping that the Clean Water Council would appreciate, I think, what is a pretty common understanding amongst the public, which is if there ever was a investment that could be made with Clean Water Fund money, soil and water conservation districts are a great investment. And I think that continued support is necessary going forward. The conversation is great. I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Chair, but I think that we're probably heading in the wrong direction if the council was to be making a decision as to how the funding gap, if there is such a thing, needs to be made. I think that we're on the right track using these dollars for SWCDs.
Okay, thank you, Representative Heinzman. Next, I have Representative Torkelson.
Well, thank you, Chair Fisher. I think it might be opportune to have Leanne Buck give her presentation. When I talked to her earlier this week, I asked that she kind of give us a little history on what's happened with SWCD funding over the last number of years. And I think that presentation would enlighten our conversation.
Okay, thank you, Representative Torkelson. Seeing that there is no more hands up at this point in time, I will then go to Ms. Buck for her testimony. Go ahead, Ms. Buck. Thank you for being here and thank you for taking the time to be part of the discussion.
Thank you and good afternoon. Again, my name is Leanne Buck and I'm the Executive Director for the Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts. And I do want to thank the Clean Water Council and Paul Gardner for their extremely important work. We've had, as Paul has mentioned, we've had several conversations. And again, as an association, as I was thinking here and listening, the words wrestle with, difficult, challenging, stressful. Yeah, that is some of the things that I think my members continue to think about as we try to look at ongoing long-term and some predictable funding as we continue to do our work. Now, with that said, I do want to thank the legislature, you as committee members and your peers in both houses for the support of Soil and Water Conservation District capacity grant funding. And again, I'm a big person about mission, meaning, and purpose. And so what you're funding basically is voluntary private lands conservation. And your investments are not just, I don't want it to be just perceived as investment for SWCDs, but it's also an investment in the landowners and ultimately your constituents, because it's through our partnership with those private landowners that we're getting clean water activities done. So I just want to reinforce that right off the top. So, you know, the history, basically what we've had, to follow up with Representative Torkelson, is in 2015, we did look at, and we received at that time, $22 million through, and then at that point it was put in the general fund ask was not there, or it didn't happen, but we did put it in. The 22 million was in the, but for the biennium was provided through clean water appropriation. And the legislature at that time did express their intent to make this part of the Board of Water and Soil Resources general fund appropriation starting in fiscal 2018. So when the governor at that time, Dayton, put together the general fund request for the Bowser budget, it was there, but it did go back into the clean water funds. So again, we were appreciative of the funding and that it was still available for soil and water conservation districts. And then at that time too, in 2017, just maybe to clarify, the tax bill that was signed into law had a provision stating that in event of a future surplus of the general fund, payment of 22 million to the Clean Water Fund be one of the automatic payments by MMB to go into, again, the 22. So there was a repayment to the Clean Water Funds for that additional funding. And so then as we went into the 2019 session, the Governor Waltz did not have it in his budget. He had made reference though to a levy, which is separate because we do look at state funding and also local funding. But what it did, we did have another 22 million that the legislature did appropriate through the Clean Water Funds. That decision wasn't made until during the special session. So again, it's been an ongoing discussion for many, kind of where we land. So at this point, I guess just to, at the stage of the game where we're at from an association's perspective, I guess it'd be fair to say that for our organization, we've been at this and looking at this. And so where we're landing is that we would like to see the 22 million, this is the first time I've said this, in 6 years, but what we're looking at as an organization is the 22 million for the SWCD capacity be funded through the Clean Water Fund. And the reason that's the first time, again, previously we have advocated it for the general fund appropriations. This is also reflecting a $2 million reduction from the 24 million that was allocated. So we do want to be part of the solution, and we understand there's going to be difficult decisions. Again, I just want to reemphasize that, as you know, these grants have been legislative directed to the Clean Water Funds for the last 3 biennium. Again, over the 6 years, I reinforce that this money has been very helpful to the soil and water districts in our delivery of that private land and clean water outcomes. And however, this is a big however, in light of the realities of our current economic climate, the input we're getting, the feedback we're getting, we can't help but speculate there's going to be pressure once again to fund the SWCD capacity out of the Clean Water Funds. And so our biggest thing is, at the end of the day, we're always feeling like we're at risk of not getting funded at all. And again, that would be a blow to our work. So again, then for some, it's not an issue of not funding us, but then it becomes of how do we cobble together state different funding from different sources. And that too, we know with a 4.5 billion or whatever that new number will be in November of a deficit, we just know that this is going to be, there's going to be difficulties in trying to find other sources. And we know the creation of whether it's new funding sources or carving out from existing funding sources that shift away. Even to the other concern too is we have that if we have a shift in some type of funding mechanism, that we still see a state responsibility, because we do currently have that local responsibility. So as an organization, we do work very closely with our county commissioners and our county partners. So the local funding for operations is been through our county partners, and the primary funding that we're looking at is the Clean Water Funds. So maybe unlike other state agencies, some of the clean water program activities are part and parcel of their additive to their programs, or it can become big for some of the agencies. But for some water districts, the Clean Water Funds is, I don't know how to say it any more than it's been a huge component of our delivery mechanism. And so it's not just a component of it, but it is a good shared responsibility of the state's commitment to our soil and water districts. So we have too been looking at these different alternatives, and where we're driving to, again, with all the pressures that we're seeing and we know you're going to be dealing with, but based on our discussions to date, we're trying to be realistic, and we do want to be part of the solution. And thus it's our conclusion for the capacity funds to move into the Clean Water Funds and not be parceled out part and parcel, or try to spread it out over 3 or 4 different biennials. Again, it just becomes somewhat challenging. So Again, we're looking at the short term. We are continuing to look at what long-term funding options, and we know it'll be different when the economic turnaround happens. There will be an economic turnaround, hopefully, but we don't know when and how soon. And based on that, that's where we're landing as an organization. So I just want to extend, these are difficult discussions and they're not easy for us as well as you. And I realize that, but we're trying to figure out, we can't find a silver bullet at this point that helps get us the predictability at the state level. So I'll turn it over for any questions or just, again, appreciate the opportunity to comment as we are now in September.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Buck. I appreciate that. I see a couple of hands have gone up. First one up is Senator Weber. If you'd like to go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Buck. I think we all understand, hopefully we all understand that the soil and water conservation districts are that's our boots on the ground. They're the people out there actually making things work. As we look at a lot of these funds, whether it's LCCMR, whether it's clean water, what have you, I think there are a group of us that look at this and boy, we're always doing a study. We like to finance studies, but sometimes we don't really do a lot to finance actual progress. And I think we should, I think the soil and water conservation districts actually represent actual progress. And so I don't think we should be all that upset if we use clean water money to fund them. Now, I'm not saying we necessarily have to fund all of that to their activities, but quite frankly, of all the things we fund, they probably have the ones that have the most tangible results for us. So I think it's important for us to keep that in mind.
Okay, thank you, Senator Weber. Next up, I have Representative Torkelson.
Thank you, Peter. So I'd like to thank Leanne for her presentation. It reveals the kind of the rocky road we've traveled with SWCD funding. It's, everybody loves the SWCDs and praises them up and down, but we have a heck of a time figuring out how to have a predictable source of funds to keep them operating efficiently. And of course, there's the issue of partnership with the counties. It's complicated, former Representative McNamara and I worked hard to build SWCD funding into the budget one cycle, but then it ultimately got removed from the budget and we ended up back in the Clean Water Fund. Then of course there was the sweep back of funds from the surplus. It's complex, but there is a real commitment there. And I think there's, as my other colleagues have expressed, there's a real understanding that this work is so valuable and it seems to many of us to be appropriate for it to be funded by clean water funds. And of course, the political climate will have some effect on that. Not that we would resist other sources, but they just don't seem to be out there. And I just want to express my commitment to making sure that soil and water conservation districts are funded. And I'm fine with it coming out of Clean Water Fund personally, and we'll just see how the next time around goes. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Representative Torkelson. Next, we have Senator Goggin. Go ahead, Senator Goggin.
Well, thank you. My question is, how many studies have we done using clean water funds? That's one question I have. Next question I have is how much money is available in the Clean Water Fund? And then lastly, myself as a project manager, we do studies and then the studies are reviewed to see if they're viable. And if they're determined to be viable, then we get the funding for it and we implement the study and the project and we get it done. And I guess what I'm looking at with the clean water funds, if we're using that money to do studies, wouldn't it make sense that we would use that money to implement the studies that are determined to be viable solutions to clean water? It just seems to me to be common sense. And I want to echo what Senator Weber has said and what Representative Torkelson has said. You know, these folks out there in the soil and water conservation districts are our boots on the ground. They're working with the farmers and the landowners, and they need to, they're doing great work out there. And I want to make sure that they understand that we're doing everything we can at the state to make sure that what we do determine to be viable solutions, that we take the money and we fund them. I think that's the right thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Goggin. And I see Representative Torkelson, your hand's up. Did you have another question or comment to make? I'm going to take that as a no. I will echo what I've been hearing from everybody also is I feel very strongly that it's important that we fund the soil water conservation districts, not only because it's the boots on the ground, but more importantly is we have to have the consistency going forward because if we don't do the funding now, we start losing those relationships that are built out there. As we've heard, it's these individual relationships that the soil and water conservation districts are making with the individual landowners. And anytime you lose people that are building those relationships sometimes are put on hold at a minimum. At a worst case, they fall apart, and then you have to start all over again, which is dollars and resources that are wasted. What I really appreciated is hearing the historical perspective, and particularly some things that were mentioned is when we have funded from clean water funds in the past, is that there's been the times where we have said if there's a surplus, it gets paid back. I would say that one of the things that I would be very comfortable with is putting out there, and I see Mr. Gardner has his hands up, is that if we do anything out of clean water funds, that we would also put a caveat on that when the next surplus is developed, that the next surpluses would then pay these funds back to get into actually funding projects that also keep our waters clean. So I will hold there and I will go to Mr. Gardner. Go ahead, sir.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to make sure that I responded to Senator Goggin. I don't know if that was a rhetorical question, but the Clean Water Fund reached an all-time high of money available in fiscal 2021 at $261 million that was appropriated. Some of that was in the process of being unallotted to deal with the May revenue forecast. But now we're looking at a likely revenue of $220 million, and that's probably with a significant margin of error. We don't know what will happen in the November revenue estimate or March. So we asked all applicants, which include a lot of state agencies, to reduce their requests significantly. So they have figured out how to right size a few things. We eliminated some programs, so we have fewer requests coming in total. So now we're at about 220, and that was hard. But now the budget committee did ask agencies to start thinking about contingency plans just in case the November revenue estimate is way off, or if there is a plan to use money for SWCDs, so that we're not taken aback, or at least the pain can be shared in the most effective way possible to stay on track. In terms of studies, the main study that the Clean Water Fund supports is called a Watershed Restoration and Protection Strategy, or RAPS. There are 80 major watersheds in the state, and all 80 will have a RAPS by fiscal 23. So we'll be done with those. But that provides a blueprint for where the sources of contamination are in our surface and drinking water, and what needs to be done to fix them, and then how much it's going to cost. And then Bowser works with local units of government and local stakeholders to prioritize how to use money from the Clean Water Fund to do projects. So we do a blueprint and then create a punch list, and then you have a priority list that's done with local input.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gardner. Senator Goggin, you have your hand up again if you'd like to go, sir.
Yeah, I just would like to thank you, Mr. Gardner, for that information. I really appreciate that. So the requests that are coming in are based off of the watershed restoration plans. Is that my understanding correctly?
Mr. Gardner.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was distracted by the only blue sky in America, which is in your background there.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, could you tell me that again, please?
So the requests that have come in this year and in previous years are they all mostly dealing with the different watershed restoration projects that are out there? Or are there other requests, other types of requests coming in? I guess I'm trying to get an understanding of what's the grouping of the various requests that come in for the Clean Water Fund money.
Very good, Mr. Chair. And Senator Goggin, the Clean Water Fund operates differently from the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund and the Outdoor Heritage Fund, which are usually, they usually disperse money on a project by project basis, where there's an applicant, sometimes within state government, sometimes not, that submits a proposal to do a specific thing within a specific timeline. The Clean Water Fund funds programmatic things, and it was set up with the intention in 2009 to address things that we could not currently do with the funds available to meet federal law, like figuring out what the total maximum daily load should be for a particular stream of, how much contamination is acceptable. All that monitoring has been done in one cycle, and now we're trying to prioritize and target dollars to figure out how to do things methodically on a watershed by watershed basis. So we do find there's always a lot of confusion, and people think we're a little bit like a foundation when in fact we're trying to do things that are either required by law or cover every watershed in the state. We're trying to find a good way in our next set of recommendations to use as much plain English as possible, which often evades us in state government, to show how everything fits together. That's our biggest challenge. And certainly people at the soil and water districts are a key cog in that machine. They actually make it all work at the local level. So we recognize their value, but we also recognize the opportunity cost of using the funds for SWCD, so we can't do some other things. And we would love to find a solution between now and May that works.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay. Are there any other comments or questions that anybody has? Is there anyone who'd like to make a final summary from either Mr. Stark or Mr. Gardner on the issue?
Well, Mr. Chair and members, I think it was important to kind of bring these issues before you to get the perspective from Ms. Buck and from Mr. Gardner about some of the complexities around this funding and the importance of SWCDs. I'm sure that this discussion will get back to the Clean Water Council, and they'll consider that your comments in their deliberations for the council. So I think it's been very helpful for me, at least, and I think for Paul and the council. And we will continue this topic. I hope at our next meeting we can have a little more information about some of the other options. But I think this has been very valuable, and thank the speakers who helped us through this.
Okay, very good. And thank you. I'd also like to thank Mr. Gardner and Ms. Buck for being available to help talk to us and help provide us with some of the information of where we've been and where we're going and the challenges that are being faced going forward. So thank you all for that. And thank you everybody for the comments and the questions and the robust discussion here. Next item that we have on the agenda then is the update of Met Council's draft report on water supply planning. We'll turn that over to Mr. Stark at this point.
Mr. Chair, I just want to very briefly alert you to a legislative report that will be coming out shortly by the Met Council. It's required every 10 years. The council would like to brief you at our next meeting. And what I'm really asking you today is to let me know what kinds of issues and questions you might have for them if you're acceptable to hearing from them. So, excuse me, the Met Council their work with Water Supplies Advisory. They work with technical and community advisory groups in developing these plans. They serve over 186 communities where the communities themselves provide public water. Their report on water supply planning is going to be included in the EQB's state water plan, and it updates the master water supply plan for the Metro. The Met Council, in short, this report will describe challenges, issues around source water protection, land use implications, conservation and land use planning. So I guess I'm asking for two things. Would you like to hear from them? They would like to brief you at our next meeting. And what questions specifically will you have for them so they can prepare for that? And you can send those to me or we can discuss those today. So that's an update on that agenda item.
Okay, I will give a sec to see if anybody's got any hands up going up. I'm not seeing hands going up at this point. I do know that I would like to be very interested in hearing from them. And some of the areas that I'm would be very interested in is what they're taking a look at sustainable use of the groundwater issue in the metropolitan area, particularly in some areas where we've got the underlying aquifers that are contaminated, and also with the future growth that's happening in the areas. I know that's been kind of a bigger thing that's been looked at here in the East Metro. And then also wanting to hear as to what is being done on alternative sources in case that there's contamination of underlying aquifers. You know, what are the redundancies that are being developed between all the different systems in the metropolitan areas, so that if one community's source goes bad for whatever reason or is cut off, what is their alternative plan? And the example I can think of is the city of Minneapolis. It gets their water exclusively from the Mississippi River, and wanting to know, you know, what the communities are doing for backup plans to address the situation. Say if they were cut off from the river for a week, what are the alternatives, or what is being done to address some of those underlying problems that are out there from a metropolitan type area. And I'm also seeing a couple other hands go up. Senator Weber is the next hand up. Senator Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to make sure I understand, is the draft report ready, or are they still in the process of preparing that, Mr. Stark?
Mr. Chair and Senator, it's draft, but they are willing to discuss that draft with you because it is a legislative report at our next meeting.
And then if I may follow up, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Senator Weber.
So are you anticipating getting that to us? I mean, or we haven't received it yet, have we?
Mr. Chair and Senator, no, you haven't, and it's being incorporated into the EQB state water plan. So I'm a bit unclear as to how that process is working, but it's a part of that larger report.
I'm just thinking, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Stark, if it might be helpful as far as developing questions to actually see the report, so we have a little better understanding of what they're actually dealing with within that report.
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead,
Mr. Chair and Senator, that's a good idea. I'll look at that and see if that's possible.
Sure. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Senator Weber. Next, we have Representative Heinzman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Stark probably can guess where I'm going to go, but I have a continuing curiosity as to the impact of PFAS. And you may have this information already, Jim, but if you don't, I'd be curious how how the Metropolitan Council is looking at the at drinking water as it's arriving to Minneapolis, and if they're looking for PFAS first, and then if they are looking for it and have found it, are they treating for it? What processes are they using to determine that the water is safe?
Mr. Chair and members, it's a good question, Representative. I think there's not a lot of monitoring going on outside of that kind of area of major concern, and I believe there's not a lot of treatment going on. But that would be a great question to bring forward at that briefing next month for those detailed questions.
Any other questions, Representative Heinzman?
That's it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, super. You're welcome. Senator Weber, I see your hand up. Do you still have any other comments or questions here? Nope. Okay. Sounds good. No, it sounds like we're all going to be looking forward to the report, and I will support what Senator Weber was saying, is that it'd be great to be able to have a draft copy of it beforehand, because I'm going to imagine that the report is probably going to be somewhat lengthy, and it'd be nice to have a chance to be able to go through it, even though it's a draft form, be able to go through and seeing what's being done and what's being addressed in it.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, sir.
and members, if I can obtain a copy of that, I'll try to get that to you. I'll also summarize what I think are the highlights in it.
Okay. And then also I'm noticing Senator Uyghur has in the comments here, will report include legislative recommendations? And also if the Met Council, if Metro Community had included water planning in their comprehensive plan requirements.
Mr. Chair and members, I think it addresses both of those as I know it.
All right, sounds very good. All right, very good. Any other questions or comments on this part of the agenda? Hearing none, let's move on to the next item. That's discussing priorities for the upcoming session. At this point, I will turn it over to Mr. Stark again.
Mr. Chair and members, at our last meeting, we talked about some of the 33 issues that were, most of those were drafted as bills for the last session, which ended abruptly in March. Most of those had committee consensus. They were drafted, introduced, and produced, and were proceeding. You mentioned at your last meeting that we should prioritize those, and I've done that based on my opinions of which of the bills had bipartisan support, had little impact on the general fund, and were of general importance to the citizens of the state. You have that list in your packet. So again, those are my opinions. What I'm proposing is that I kind of reorganize that list and circulate it to you for your comments, and for your comments about their importance. If you're willing to support them individually, it may possibly some of those you may want to remove your name as support. But I'd just like some feedback on those as we prioritize and tune that list and reduce it in detail. And there are details on each of these bills that are available if you want to question, if you have questions. But I would just suggest I'll send that one-page document to you. If you could just send me some comments, that would be very helpful in narrowing down the focus for the next session.
Okay, very good.
Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stark. Are there any questions or comments that people would like to, or items that they'd like to raise at this point in time? I know one thing that pops to my mind as I've looked at the list. I know that some of these had, a number of these had committee hearings, and I was wondering how, if there's been any proposed amendments to any of them that are also making sure that are not lost as we're moving these forward for next year. And so that'd be one of the questions or one of the thoughts I would have, is making sure that we're checking to see if there was any updates, any of the committees and any of the bodies, to make sure that when we bring them forward, bringing forward what reflects the most current work that was done.
Mr. Chair, I believe there were a few amendments, but I can check on that.
Okay, and that would be helpful to know as we're going forward, because we want to make sure that we don't lose some of the good work that we've had happening in the process. Any other questions or comments on prioritizing things for the next session? Okay, from hearing none, we will move on. I know that there was some additional information that was also sent out to us, so I'll turn things over to Mr. Stark at this point in time.
Mr. Chair, members, I just want to say a word about, also at our previous meeting, you heard about the University of Minnesota report on the future of drinking water. And see, I've lost my internet connection here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. And that report, which is very lengthy, in my opinion, listed about 7 or 8 things that may be potential legislative actions. I have short descriptions of those. At our next meeting, I'd like to narrow that list down, in my opinion, and present you with some text which you could consider for possible bills. So there's a lot of good information in that report. It was funded by the Department of Health, and there are a lot of issues there that I think focus on needs for drinking water. And I'd just like us to keep that on our radar for the next session, and I will bring you more information about what I think might be the potential for legislation from those bills at our next meeting.
Okay, very good. Anything else that we have left to cover for today's meeting, sir?
Mr. Chair, maybe a couple of details. First of all, I did want to mention the map that's in your packet. That relates back to that first topic about the Upper Mississippi. If you have any questions about that map, you can shoot them to me, and I'll get Dan Stewart and Megan Lennon from the Board of Water and Soil Resources to answer those. Just another word about something we've talked about in the past, the Salt and Chloride Symposium, which I attended. Again, there were things in there that I think are priority issues that the committee may want to consider for legislation. Some of those involve things that you reached consensus on last session. I will get back to you on those and try to summarize those briefly into things that might be legislative topics. But with that, Sue Nissen from the Save Our Salt folks is here and would like to say a word about this issue of salt and chloride. So, Ms. Nissen, are you still with us?
I
can
am.
see you. Ms. Nissen, if you'd like to go ahead, please. Thank you for being here today.
Okay, thank you, Chair Fisher, members, Mr. Stark. My name is Sue Nissen. I'm a master water steward with Stopover Salting. And I have had conversations with many of you about over application of salt, and know that you want to see excess chloride addressed statewide. And my ask of you today is quite simple. It's just to keep the committee focused on chloride reduction this year. I know you have a lot on your plates, and I don't want to see chloride get scooped off, especially because at the Salt Symposium that Mr. Stark was talking about last month, we learned that our state's chloride load is just under 1 million metric tons. That's from a variety of point and non-point sources, everything they could identify. But as a master water steward, that number blows my mind. It's staggering. And it's not only because that's this year, but it was probably last year and the year before, and we've got an accumulation going in our water, and it's permanent. So against that backdrop, another 1 million tons of salt use, I'm just here to urge you to decipher what's the fastest and actually the most effective way to start some meaningful chloride reduction this upcoming year. Whether it's road salts, softeners, fertilizers, training, education, there are millions of opportunities. So that's what I wanted to say to you today. And I thank you for your time today, for your commitment to reduction. And Mr. Stark, thanks for attending the Salt Symposium. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ms. Neeson. And I'm noticing Representative Brand has his hand up. Let's see if things will work this time. Representative Brand.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Awesome.
Perfect. I just want to remind the committee that in my district, I have a mall that uses as much salt on their impervious surfaces than the city of St. Peter uses in a winter. And so part of that conversation could truly be about the liability and what we could do on that end of things too. We want people to be safe. We want their customers to be safe, but a lot of road salt is used to keep those folks safe. And I think that there may be other methods that could be used to ensure that safety.
Thank you, Representative Brand. Representative Heinzman.
Representative Brand jolted me back to the last conversation that we've had on this topic. I wanted to thank him for bringing up the liability question, because that is obviously the elephant in the room. And I'm really glad, because I know, I guess I should put context there. I'm really glad that we all recognize in a bipartisan way what we're up against on trying to resolve that issue. And I'm confident that this group can lead that discussion, and that we can see positive change and make sure that we're absolutely fighting this thing wherever we can. And there is low-hanging fruit, and I'm glad that we're talking about it again today. Thank you to the testifier for coming in. I'm not sure how I could become a master water expert of some kind, but I'm glad those people are out there. Glad you're here and talking about this issue, because it just seems like it's so simple. We have this problem, there's got to be solutions. Otherwise, the cumulative effect is devastating. So I'm glad that it's a part of today's discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. I am seeing Representative Brand, your hand's back up. Do you have anything else you'd like to add? Okay, super. Are there any other comments that people have that they'd like or questions they have on the salt symposium and chloride issue our state is facing? I'm not seeing any. I want to say to Ms. Neeson, thank you so much for your leadership and what you've been doing over the last few years to raise this issue at our level. I know that if you had not taken this kind of action and shown your dedication to this issue, that we would not be where we are today on our understanding of it. I know that it's really helped us. We've been trying to advance this at the legislature the last couple of years. I'm really hoping that in the next legislative session that we can move some of these bills forward. And so thank you so much for what you've done on your volunteer basis there. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Representative Fisher.
You're welcome. Next, subcommittee plans. Okay, we'll go back to Representative Stark here. I see that based on the, we've got some questions here that he's got for us. Let's go ahead, sir.
Mr. Chair and members, we've discussed this at our last meeting, but we've talked a lot about things today, about a lot of things. I think these could warrant another good meeting. So I guess my short message here is, can you spare an hour or so in October? I would like us to have another meeting in October and then maybe one in the latter part of November after the elections, if we could, where we could maybe dive in a little deeper. But if I could get your permission to try to schedule a meeting in October, that would be great.
Okay, maybe we could try the raise hands. I'm seeing thumbs going up. If you're interested in that for October and November, why don't you use the raise hand function or the thumbs up function on the. I'm seeing hands going up here. I'm getting a from what I'm seeing here. It looks like we would definitely have a quorum at the next. And once again, I would imagine be setting the time on it. That it looks like people are open to doing something for the month of October. What I'm wondering from what I've heard from people before, and I would ask people to chime in on this one. If we shoot for something in October, I think it would be best if we could try to do something that would be in the morning versus in the afternoon. And I would look forward to feedback to what folks' thoughts are on that, trying to see if we could. Because what I've heard before is some people think it's better in the morning to have these meetings versus afternoon. Are there any other thoughts on that from other folks out there?
Mr. Chair, if I could, what I've done for the last couple of meetings is set some times with the chairs and then gone out to all the members or their reps and tried to find the best time and the best day. And that takes some digging, but that worked very well for this meeting and has in the past. So you kind of have to hit each of the members individually.
Okay, sounds good. Senator Weber, I see you just raised your hand. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, 6 o'clock in the morning is always a good time.
I would be operating at that time at certain points, but we'll see how everything else is. I don't know if the House is quite ready to be doing it that early for YouTube. But thank you for the suggestion. Go ahead. We'll turn it back to Mr. Stark.
Mr. Chair, just in closing, just want to remind you of the Water Resource Conference, which is going to be virtual this year. A couple of the members are going. If you're interested, shoot me an email or something and I can get the registration fee covered for that, but that would be a virtual meeting. And so we have several things to talk about at our next meeting, and thanks for the opportunity to have one in October. I appreciate that. And with that, Mr. Chair, if there are any further discussion items, thank you so much for attending today. Had really good representation, and I think this was a great meeting. Okay. And I'd like to thank the speakers.
Thank you, Mr. Stark. Before we adjourn here, I'm going to keep an eye out for any hands popping up. Does anyone have anything else that they would like to cover at today's meeting? I'll give it a couple of seconds here. I also too will thank everyone for being able to participate today. I'd like to thank our speakers and also to our staff for making sure that we're able to pull this off with the minimum amount of disruptions through here. So thank you, everyone. I'm not seeing any hands going up. So at this point in time, I would declare the meeting adjourned. Thank you so much for your time, everybody. Thanks for being here. Have a great day.
Thank you.